Well, the Internal Revenue Service of the United States is looking to hire 87,000 new workers so that they can turbocharge their auditing infrastructure and start wringing as much dough out of the American taxpayer as possible. Because there aren't enough people who are already struggling under the tremendous amount of stress that you are put under by an IRS audit, they want tens of thousands of new IRS workers to process even more audits in order to close the budget deficit. Because you see, the reason why we have such big deficits in this country is because those tax cheats are just not paying their fair share. And so if we can just squeeze, an extra, $1,000 or $2,000 out of the average middle-class worker, then everything will be okay. Inflation will go away. Our debt will stop increasing. We won't hit $50 trillion in debt. We'll stop at 30 trillion or wherever it is the next big milestone is. I stopped following how much, what the national debt is a long time ago, because it's at this point, once you get to a certain point, it's just numbers at that point. It's a bunch of digits. They don't mean anything. But that was Virginia Senator Joe Manchin. He's real concerned about these deficits and inflation, as you all know. And so he said, you know what? The reason why we've got all this inflation is because we're running big budget deficits, right? Because the government has to print new money to spend when they go over the amount that they're taking in tax revenue. So he said, I got an idea. Let's just start trying to make sure that we collect more taxes. And then if we just collect more taxes, even without raising the tax rates, we'll be able to reduce inflation, because then we won't have to print as much money, right? And the end result is that more and more normal people will have the IRS banging down their door, wanting to dig into every aspect of their life and snoop in and out of the most intimate financial details, and put them under months and months of stress, which will, let's be honest, drive some people to suicide. Others will just have heart attacks or strokes from the stress. People regularly die as a result of the stress that they're put under by intense legal or financial strain, especially when that strain is induced over a prolonged period, like a number of months. Now, it's one thing to get audited if you're, some multimillionaire and you make lots of money and you have the money to pay people to deal with your audit. You pay for good accountants, who will take the fall if there's something wrong, with your, with your taxes. You pay somebody to deal with all that, and you can pay people to help you, and you don't have to directly, comply with the audit. But if you're an ordinary person, you have nobody to turn to for help. You just have the government, who is trying to do everything they can to, at the very least, steal more money from you, or at worst, put you in prison. And at the same time, you still have to try and get by in your ordinary, normal life when the cost of living is out of control, when you're not making enough money at your job, and you're having to take on second or third jobs just to make ends meet and keep your head above water. Then you have to deal with a fourth job, a third or fourth job of dealing with the IRS. Now, the worst part of all this, in one way, is that they're going to be able to find 87,000 people who are willing to take part in all of this terrible, terrible behavior. They're going to dredge up 87,000 of the worst people in American society who are willing to try and go and essentially torture their neighbors and try to extract money from them. They're willing to go after, single moms and dads, or struggling couples, with two or more kids, or aging seniors, with no living relatives to help them. And they're going to try and take advantage of them and take more money than they already take every single year. And they'll do it happily, because they don't like you, because they're bad people fundamentally. Remember, that's the case. There are some government agencies where, if someone works for the government, they're not necessarily a bad person. If you're if you work in the National Forest Service and your job is to drive a dozer all day, to plow, rings around sections of forest so that they can do controlled burns, I'm not going to call you a supervillain, okay? You're doing a job, and it's actually a useful job, because we need to have controlled burns in the national forests, or else you end up with places like California. But if you're somebody who works at the IRS, you have no redeeming qualities. Like, there's no context in which anyone who works for the IRS in any capacity is a good person. Same thing if you work for, let's say, the CIA. Or at this point, the FBI. Once upon a time, I can understand people who got into the FBI because they're like, oh, well, I want to solve murders. Hey, sure, I can understand that in the early 2000s. That's what we thought the FBI was about. We thought, oh, you're an FBI agent. That means that, you track down serial killers, who are across state lines. That sounds fun and productive. But nowadays, we know, no, the FBI, they're just a domestic intelligence service who are trying to entrap ordinary, everyday Americans and destroy their lives over potential political differences. And in fact, they're even willing to manufacture enemies of the regime and groom people into becoming potential terrorists so that they can arrest them and destroy their lives under those pretenses, just so that they can, show their boss, look how many people I've busted this month. And so there are, the vast majority of federal agencies are completely irredeemable. The IRS ranking among the worst. In 2022, federal workers can be seen appropriately as enemies of the American people, and folks whose raison d'etre amounts to trying to make our lives as difficult as possible. Our government, for the past few decades, really since the end of World War II, has constantly been at war overseas with every people on this planet, every nation on this planet, other than the American people. And now they've run out of countries and nations and cultures to abuse. And so they're turning their guns inward. In the words of, I saw Jesse Kelly earlier on Twitter today. I'm paraphrasing him, but he said essentially that these 87 IRS workers should appropriately be regarded as soldiers in a war on the American people, and that their sole purpose is to cause us pain and to try to ruin us. When you approach someone with that understanding, it really changes your perspective on life, doesn't it? And at the end of the day, you're going to be much better off, because you can't trust someone from the federal government. They're not someone who should ever be given the benefit of the doubt. They're always scheming and looking for some way to destroy you. Frankly, I don't know how they sleep at night. I couldn't imagine, having them on my street, because it would be, it'd be like having, a Soviet sleeper down the street. Except it'd be worse because, you don't have, in America in the 1980s, you didn't really have to worry about the KGB coming and breaking down your door and taking you away in the middle of the night. Whereas in America in 2022, if you have an American sleeper, in the form of a federal agent living on your block, and they report you to the authorities, you could have the FBI or the ATF or the IRS or the GAO or the BLM, Bureau of Land Management, the National Park Service, who knows? You could have any number of those agencies, which are all armed to the teeth, break down your door and whisk you away in the middle of the night and not tell anybody where you went. And in our increasingly totalitarian state, crimes against the national interest are broadening in definition rapidly. What used to get you labeled an enemy of the state and, worthy of having your life turned upside down, it used to be something much more specific. Something like, aiding and abetting a foreign power during a time of war. That used to be what we call treason. Now, questioning the constitutional power of certain government agencies, is enough to get you labeled an enemy of the state. Especially tax protesters, the people who argue against the constitutionality of some of our tax laws. Those folks have been singled out by the FBI, in multiple publications that they've made, multiple white papers that they've put out talking about people who are, threats to America and to our society. They're very worried about these people who have a different interpretation of the U.S. Constitution than, the one that is dominated, or the one that is dominant within, the halls of the federal government. I look at all this, and I try and look for analogs in the past to the way our government thinks about us and treats us versus, other governments that have treated their people with the same contempt in the past, and it never ends well. It's never a stable situation. It's something that never lasts, for centuries. It's usually something that ends in disaster for the regime. Now, in most cases, the disaster strikes the people long before, and a lot of people end up under the boot and getting run over by the steamroller of the totalitarian state. But in time, that level of totalitarianism is unsustainable, particularly in a big and diverse country like the United States. So at the rate we're going, I think that within my lifetime, we are going to see, there's going to be a reckoning. And I think that all of these institutions will collapse. And the people who were a part of them, who aided and abetted them, who worked, and toiled day after day, year after year, decade after decade for these agencies will be regarded with contempt by their neighbors. Just like the retired Stasi agents in East Germany who are still paid their pension, their neighbors know who they are, and they hate them because they were bad people. Frankly, there's just too much that doesn't make sense about America these days. Yes, there's the financial situation. Our government operates by printing money every year, and somehow, yes, we have a lot of inflation right now, but we're not into hyperinflation. We're not at 100, 200% yet. We're in the teens. Those are amateur numbers when you compared to countries that have actually collapsed because of inflation. Inflation would have to get a lot worse than it is now for our regime to truly collapse. I didn't used to think that. I thought that this would be plenty bad enough inflation because of the inflation premium on the rate of interest, and the inflation premium just doesn't seem to exist anymore. Interest rates don't care about inflation. They don't make sense to me. But the fact that the regime has to crack down this hard on people and, is increasingly less and less tolerant of dissent. Back during the Cold War, there were active supporters of the Soviet Union, in the public sphere. Were they a majority? Never know. But, within the Wizards of Smart, there were a lot of people who thought that, communism wasn't such a bad idea, and that the Soviets, were conducting a noble experiment. And because, communism was so obviously a bad idea, the regime didn't have to crack down on people nearly as much as they do today. Early on, sure they did. There was stuff like in the 50s and things. It was very unfashionable and politically incorrect, to be aligned with the Soviets. But as time went on, people could express that openly. And certainly people were never, thrown in prison for their political views like we've seen with the January 6th folks. And, you never saw them being issued $50 million judgments like Alex Jones. Maybe I'm missing something in history because I didn't live through the period. That's perfectly possible, but I do not remember the level of political prosecutions at any point during the Cold War that we're witnessing today. In the long run, I think that these Soviet-style show trials being conducted in America are going to erode the regime's credibility to a much greater degree than it eroded the Soviet regimes, because you see the Soviet regime in Russia, they never exactly had a tradition of a fair legal system to begin with, and also the population and information was under far greater control and much more strictly managed than information can be controlled in the United States. So all in all, I think that these new IRS agents are going to do more harm for the regime than good, because yes, they will be raking in, some more money, but the regime doesn't need money. They print whatever money they need. They could lower taxes down to zero at this point, and I'm not convinced that things would change a whole hell of a lot, as far as they're concerned. But one difference that these new IRS workers will make is that if they're able to audit more and more people, and presumably they're going to be auditing poorer and poorer people, because I'm sure the auditing capacity that they have is already committed to all of the high value targets that they would want to pursue. And so all of these new workers, you can bet, are going to just audit poorer and poorer people, and they're going to audit a greater number of them. And so the result will be that more and more Americans come to hate the IRS and dread them than they already do. And in turn, they will come to hate the federal government. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.